The first thing I noticed wasn't the fear in her eyes. It was the way she kept looking over her shoulder as if every passing shadow carried a memory she couldn't outrun. The coffee shop was crowded with people chasing ordinary mornings, laptops open, conversations flowing, cups clinking against saucers, yet somehow the air around her felt different. Heavy. Fragile. She walked straight toward my table without hesitation, her hands trembling so badly that the coffee she carried nearly spilled over the rim. Before I could ask whether she had mistaken me for someone else, she quietly lowered herself into the empty chair across from me and whispered that her ex was watching. She didn't ask for help. She didn't beg me to save her. She simply looked at me with the exhausted eyes of someone who had spent too many nights surviving instead of sleeping. In that single moment, my peaceful morning disappeared forever, and I had no idea that 1 year later a little girl would wrap her tiny arms around my neck and call me daddy. Before we continue, if you believe kindness can change someone's life, if you believe people deserve second chances, and if stories like this remind you that hope still exists in the world, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, share this story with someone who needs encouragement today, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. Every small act of support helps us bring more heartfelt stories to people around the world. Until that morning, my life had been remarkably ordinary. I was 35 years old, worked as an architect, lived alone in a modest apartment overlooking the river, and followed the same routine almost every day. Friends often joke that I treated routine like religion because everything about my life happened according to schedule. I visited the same neighborhood coffee shop every Saturday at exactly 8 in the morning, always sat by the large front window, ordered the same black coffee, and spent 2 quiet hours sketching building designs while soft jazz drifted through the speakers. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was peaceful. After losing both my parents in a car accident years earlier, I had learned to appreciate peace more than excitement. That morning started no differently. Rain tapped gently against the windows while gray clouds covered the city like a blanket. The familiar smell of roasted coffee beans mixed with fresh pastries filled the room, creating the comforting atmosphere I had come to depend on. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have found a little corner of the world where nothing unexpected ever happened. Life, however, has a strange way of interrupting the promises we make to ourselves. She couldn't have been older than 30. Her blonde hair was tied into a hurried ponytail that had already begun falling apart. Dark circles beneath her eyes suggested weeks of sleepless nights. She wore a simple blue sweater that looked slightly too large, as though she had lost weight recently. There was nothing glamorous about her appearance, yet there was an undeniable dignity in the way she carried herself despite obvious exhaustion. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply trying to make it through another day. After sitting down, she stared toward the window without speaking again. Her breathing was shallow. Every few seconds her eyes drifted toward a black SUV parked across the street. At first I assumed she might be mistaken or overly anxious, but then I noticed the driver inside the vehicle. He wasn't reading a newspaper or checking his phone. He was watching the coffee shop. Watching our table. I felt a knot tighten inside my stomach. The stranger finally introduced herself as Emma, though her voice barely rose above a whisper. She apologized for involving me in something I didn't understand and admitted she had chosen my table because I looked safe. Those words stayed with me long after that morning ended. Not because I believed I was particularly brave or extraordinary, but because it made me wonder how many unsafe faces she had encountered before deciding mine seemed different. As the minutes passed, I learned only fragments of her story. She had recently left a long relationship that had slowly become controlling before turning frightening. It hadn't started with shouting or threats. It had started with isolation. Small criticisms disguised as concern. Tiny rules disguised as love. Gradually, friends disappeared, confidence faded, and fear quietly settled into every corner of her life. By the time she realized she needed to leave, escaping had become far more dangerous than staying. She wasn't worried about herself anymore. She was worried about her 5-year-old daughter, Lily. That little girl was waiting safely with Emma's older sister across town while lawyers tried to untangle custody paperwork that seemed to move painfully slower than fear itself. Emma admitted she hadn't slept properly in months because every unfamiliar car outside her apartment made her wonder whether her past had found her again. Looking toward the SUV, I asked whether we should call the police. She sadly explained that there wasn't enough evidence. Her ex knew exactly how far he could push without crossing legal lines. He never threatened her where witnesses could hear. He never followed closely enough for police reports to matter. He simply appeared often enough to remind her that she could never truly relax. Fear had become part of her daily routine. I wanted to believe there was something simple I could do. Some clever solution. Some heroic action. But real life rarely offers dramatic answers. Sometimes the only thing another person can give is quiet company. So I stayed. For nearly an hour we talked about ordinary things instead of frightening ones. We spoke about favorite childhood books, rainy afternoons, terrible cooking experiments, and how children somehow manage to laugh even after difficult days. Gradually, I noticed Emma's shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. The tension never disappeared completely, but for the first time since she'd entered the cafe, she smiled. It was small. Almost invisible. But it was real. When she finally stood to leave, the SUV pulled away before she reached the sidewalk. Whether the driver had grown bored or simply decided his message had already been delivered, I couldn't tell. Emma thanked me for doing something she said few people ever did. Listening. Not fixing. Not judging. Just listening. I watched her disappear into the rainy street carrying far more weight than the small handbag resting on her shoulder. I assumed I would never see her again. Life had other plans. Over the following weeks, Saturday mornings became different. Emma occasionally appeared at the coffee shop around the same time. Sometimes she stayed only 15 minutes. Sometimes we spent hours talking about rebuilding life after loss. I eventually met Lily, whose bright smile seemed almost miraculous considering everything she'd already witnessed. She loved drawing butterflies because, according to her, butterflies proved that broken things could become beautiful again. I smiled at the innocence of those words, never realizing they would someday describe all three of us. Yet happiness remained fragile. Every laugh carried caution. Every peaceful afternoon felt borrowed. Emma continued receiving anonymous flowers she never wanted. Empty phone calls arrived late at night. Strange cars appeared near her apartment before disappearing whenever neighbors looked outside. Nothing was dramatic enough for headlines. Everything was terrifying enough to steal sleep. Watching her fight exhaustion while protecting Lily changed something inside me. I had spent years convincing myself that keeping life simple meant keeping it safe. But safety without purpose slowly becomes loneliness disguised as comfort. Without realizing it, I had begun caring far more deeply than friendship alone could explain. I didn't know whether Emma noticed. I wasn't even sure I wanted her to. Because loving someone carrying invisible scars requires accepting that healing cannot be rushed. Sometimes all you can do is stay long enough for trust to grow. And sometimes that becomes the bravest choice of all. What I didn't know was that someone else had also noticed. Someone who believed Emma leaving him was a story that deserved a very different ending. And before autumn arrived, our quiet little coffee shop would become the center of a confrontation none of us were prepared to face.